Hey guys, so today Leek put out a story that is centered around Shurima and it kind of explains more of the lore that they've put out a couple weeks ago. So we're going to go ahead and read it. It's 12 chapters, so it is quite long, but we will go ahead and read it and we will just go right into it. So this is chapter 1. Talia had almost forgotten how much she had missed the furnace heat of Shurima, the sweat and the crush of hundreds of people pushing, cursing, haggling, and speaking with such passion and speed that outsiders often thought they were fighting. In her travels, she never found anywhere with the sheer bustle and energy of her homeland. Ionia was wondrous, the frozen landscapes of the Freljord were stunning in their own way, but the blazing sun of Shurima melted them from her memory as she set foot on the stone wharf of Belzoon. The connection she felt with this land's bedrock surged through her like one of Baba Jan's spiced teas. She'd been grinning from ear to ear as she climbed the steps from the docks, and even passing beneath the black stone of the Noxatora that couldn't dampen her spirits. Talia hadn't stayed long in Belzoon. The Noxian warships in the harbor made her too nervous and brought back bad memories. She remained just long enough to buy supplies and catch the latest market stall rumors carried from the deep desert by trade caravans. Most of it was conflicting and fantastical. Visions of sand warriors, blizzards of lightning from clear skies, and rivers overflowing where no water had run for as far back as anyone could remember. For the sake of friendly faces, she left Belzoon in the company of a heavily armed caravan and the Nearizimith silk merchants heading south to the Canaanith. She'd endured the rolling motion of the caravan long enough to reach the stone soak of the notorious city on the southern borders of the Sai before striking out on her own. The caravan master, a whip-thin woman named Samara, with eyes of like polished jet, advised against traveling farther south, but Talia had told her that her family needed her and that there were no more warnings. From Kennethit, she pushed ever south, following the winding arc of what people were once again calling the Mother of Life, a great river said to have had its source in the capital of an ancient Shuriman empire. With no one around, she could make much better time, traveling with the rock as her steed. As riding its leading edge, she shaped it beneath her in sweeping waves that carried her southward towards Velcura, the city she'd been told was half buried in the sand creeping out from the Sai. Shamara had dismissed it as little more than a tribal camp built on the ruins of an abandoned city, a meeting place for weary travelers and wandering nomads. But even from a mile away, Talia saw that she'd been misled. Velcura was reborn. If only she hadn't found the dying woman. Chapter 2. The city sulk was awash in color and noise. Pungent air rolled down an arced, canvas awing street in the wave, freighted with the sound of furious haggling and the smell of tangy spices and roasted meat. Talia pushed her way through the crowds, ignoring the merchants' extravagant promises and pleas to think of their starving children. A hand grasped her robe, seeking to pull her towards the stall laden with racks of spitted desert vermin, but she pulled away. Hundreds of people thronged in the wide street leading to the broken walls of the city. Aromatic smoke drifted like fog from the bubbling pipes of an old man sitting in doorways like wizened sages. She saw the tribal markings of Barbe, Zagaya, and Yeshurje, though there were dozens more that she didn't know. Tribesmen who would have sworn enemies back when she'd left Shurima now walked side by side like brothers in arms. "A lot has changed since I've been gone," she whispered to herself. She had what she'd come for and needed to get back into the ruined building she had chosen on the eastern edge of the city. She didn't want to linger any longer than necessary, but she'd made the promise She'd made a promise to keep the injured woman safe, and her mother had always taught her to never break a promise. The great weaver took a dim view of such people. The roughly woven bag over her shoulder was filled with food. Cured meats, oats, bread, cheese, along with 2 skins of water. More than she would need, but it wasn't all for her. The gold-sewn linings of her robes were almost gone. She knew she wasn't far now. She had no way of knowing for certain, but she felt sure her every step was bringing her nearer to the warm embrace of her mother and father. After that, she wouldn't need gold. She'd have all she needed right there in the tent with her. So lost in the pleasant future was Talia that she didn't notice the big man until she ran into him. She bounced off his unmoving body and laid flat on her backside. It felt like walking into a cliff, not an inch of give to it. People in the sulk seemed to know that better than her. They flowed around him like water around a rock in a stream. He was dressed from head to toe in tattered robes that did not conceal his enormous bulk and weight and height. He held fast and long a cloth-wrapped staff, its wide head bound in rags. Perhaps he needed it because she saw his legs were strangely angled. "Excuse me," she said, looking up. "I didn't see you." He looked down at her, his face hidden in the shadows of the elongated cowl, but didn't answer. He held out his hand, the fingers swathed in bandages like a plague victim. Talia hesitated for only a moment and took the proffered hand. He lifted her up with barely any effort at all, and he saw the gleam of gold beneath the dusty fabric of his robes before he clasped his hands back within his sleeves. "Thank you," said Talia. "You should watch your step, little one," he said, his voice heavily accented in a strange resonance. It's coming from the depthless well of sadness within him. Shurima is a dangerous place now. Chapter 3. He watched the young girl run off through the sulk and turn towards the cracked walls of Valkyra. The giant blocks only reached his head. The courses higher were formed of sun-baked bricks painted to match. To the people of Valkyra it must have looked impressive, but to his eyes it was a poor copy of the real thing. He strolled through the gateway, looking up at the crudely fitted stone overhead. A water vendor standing in the midst of a brass contraption of spinning wheels and that dispensed gritty water into bottles of green glass, looked up as he passed. "Water? Fresh from the mother of," said the vendor, but the words died in his throat at the sight of the towering form before him. He knew he should keep moving. The words scrawled in blood on the walls of the astrologer's tower had guided him here. The magus would have been drawn to this place. He sensed the presence of one of the ascended bloodline in Valkyra, one who could trace their lineage back to the days before the empire that stretched from the ocean to the sea, from ocean to ocean, and beyond, was brought to ruin. To find that person before his enemy would be crucial, for the blood of the ancient Shuriman was rare and potent. He had brought Azir back from oblivion and into the wrong hands, and in the wrong hands could bring doom to the reborn Shurima. Yes, he should keep moving, but he did not. "You trade among ghosts of the past," he said. "Ghosts?" said the vendor, his voice wavering in fear. "This archway," he said, jabbing his staff towards the roof of the arch. Dust fell in veils through the cracks from the man walking on the ramparts above. Exile craftsmen from the lost Ithaca built it. Each stone was cut and fitted with such precision that not a drop of mortar was required to lock it in place. I did not know that." "You mortals forget the past and consign to legend that which ought be remembered," he said, the bitterness of centuries lost in the deep desert threatening to become violent anger. "Did I not build a great library to guard against such failures of remembrance?" "Please, great lord," said the water vendor, pressing his back against the wall of the gateway, "you speak of myths of ancient times. to you, but when I first came here the walls were newly raised, 200 feet of polished marble, every stone pristine and veined with gold. My brother and I entered the city in triumph at the head of 10,000 gold-armored soldiers in that burnished spears. We marched through this gateway to the cheers of the city's people. He let out a rumbling sigh before continuing. A year later it was all gone. It was the end of everything, or perhaps it was the beginning. I have turned from the world so long I can no longer tell. The water vendor paled, squinting in an attempt to penetrate the darkness beneath his cowl. The man's eyes widened. "You're the lost son of the desert," said the vendor. "You're Nassus." "I am," he said, turning away and entering the city. "But there is another, far more lost than I." Chapter 4. Nassus followed the crowds moving through the city towards the temple and its heart, trying not to notice their stares. Its bulk alone would attract attention, but the water vendor would now have spread his identity far and wide. Shurima had always been a place of secrets, none of which cared to remain buried for long. By the time he reached the center of the city, he'd be surprised if the entire population did not know his name. Yes, it had been foolish to stop, but the vendor's lack of regard for history offended the scholar in Nassus. Like the wall and gateway, Valkyria's interior was a shadow of its former glory. Azir's mother had been born here, and the young emperor had been lavish in his gifts to its people. Stepped gardens and flowers brought from every corner of the empire garlanded its structures in vivid color and wondrous secrets. Its towers gleamed with silver and jade, and cool water flowed from the great temple, running alongside great aqueducts, and the native belief its bounty would never end. The passing millennia had worn the city down to its exposed skeleton of stone, its once magnificent structures reduced to ruins. Those ruins had been built upon over the past few centuries by those who clung to the old ways, believing their future might be saved by revering the past. As Nassus followed the growing crowds, he only saw crude imitations of an all but forgotten memory. Buildings planned by master craftsmen were now crooked parodies of their former glory. Walls once fashioned from square-cut granite were built over in timber and crudely shaped blocks. The city's original outline was still there, but Nassus felt like he was moving through a nightmare, where once familiar surroundings were skewed in new and strange forms, where everything was twisted from its original form in ways designed to unsettle. He heard murmuring voices around him, his name spoken in hushed whispers, but he ignored them. Finally turning the corner and entering the open plaza at the heart of the city. His clawed hands clenched into fists at the sight of what the citizens of Valkyria had raised in the heart of the rebuilt city. A sun temple built of chiseled sandstone and bare rock, raised by human hands to human scale. It was a child's recreation of the titanic structure that sat at the heart of the Shuriman Empire. The Grand Temple had been the envy of all Valorian, and the architects of distant kings had traveled thousands of miles to see it. And this was how it was insultingly remembered. The walls were black and gleamed like basalt, but Nassus could see the uneven joints between the panels where they had been fixed to the rough stone beneath. The sun disk gleamed atop the temple, but even from here Nassus could see that it was not fashioned from gold, but wrought from an alloyed bronze and copper. Nor did it float like the disk beneath, which Nassus had been transformed into his current form. Instead, braided ropes tied to asymmetrical pillars on each side of the disk held it aloft. Part of Nassus wanted to rage against these people, to hate them for building this ugly remembrance of the Empire he and countless others had fought and bled to win. He wanted to shake them and tell them that they had despoiled by building upon the grandeur of the past, but they did not know what he knew, and had not seen what he had seen, and he could not make them understand. A feathered robed Hierophant stood before the disk, his eyes raised in supplication, though his words were lost in the city's noise. Was this the one he had come to find? Chapter 5. He crossed the plaza towards the temple with purposeful strides, seeing the irregular steps cut into each of its four corners. Two warriors, armored in form-fitting strips of bronze and feathered helmets molded to represent beasts, stood guarding the approaches of the stairs. They turned at the sight of him. Nasus faltered as he recognized who their helms were intended to represent. Both had elongated snouts, one the crude imitation of crocodilian jaws, and the other with a visor molded into a snarling jackal's head. They leveled their spears as he approached, but he read their shock as he cast off his robe and stood at his full height. For too long he had wandered the world of mortals, hunched over and ashamed, seeking to hide his stature. For too long he had hidden himself away and paid his penance in bleak isolation. But the days of concealment were over. Nasus had no desire to keep his true form hidden any longer. Towering over the guards, Nasus was a figure of might and magic, an ascended being from the age in which heroes walked among mortals. His head had been raised up by magic, the magic of the sun disk, and remade. His withered, dying flesh transformed into the jackal-headed demigod of the obsidian flesh. Banded golden armor, tarnished with age, hung in votive strips embossed with signals of Shurima, unfolded his chest and shoulders. He reached up and tore the cloth bindings from his staff to reveal his long hefted war axe. Its edge glittered in anticipation, the ocean blue gemstone at its heart drinking in the sunlight. "Stand aside," he said. The guards quailed in fear, but stood their ground. Nasus sighed and spun his axe in a looping arc. The end caught the first guard on the upward stroke and hurled him back 30 yards. His reverse stroke drove the second into the dust, leaving him groaning in pain as Nasus set a clawed foot on the bottom step. He climbed towards the summit where the sun gleamed on the beaten metal of the disk. As he climbed, he looked beyond Valkyra's crumbling city walls. An unbroken sea of barren dunes stretched to the horizon on all sides. On the city's eastern flank, the land steadily rose in haunches of rugged foothills of stubborn earth, upon which grew hardy desert palms and thick stands of behever trees, whose roots plunged hundreds of meters below the sand to find water. The sight of Shurima as this empty desert saddened Nasus, thinking back to when the Mother of Life had nourished the land, and it had bloomed with life and vitality. Perhaps Azir would bring life to Shurima again, perhaps not, which made his task of finding the one who bore the bloodline all more vital. Other guards were moving to the top of the temple, shouting in language that owed it a debt to ancient Shuriman, but none of its beauty and complexity of that lost tongue. Nasus remembered the pain and fear he had felt during his final ascent of the great temple in preparation for his ascension ritual. The wasting sickness had left him too weak to climb, and he had been carried in the arms of his young brother. By the time he reached the summit, the sun was almost at his zenith, and his life was pouring out of him like sands of a broken hourglass. He begged Renekton to go, to leave him to meet the sun alone, but Renekton simply shook his head and whispered their last shared words as mortals before the sun disk took them both to ascension. "I will be with you until the end." Even now those words still had power to wound him, cutting deeper than any blade. As a mortal, Renekton was unpredictable, and sometimes prone to violence and cruelty, but equally capable of great nobility and courage. The power ascension granted him made him mighty, and in the end it had been Renekton who wrestled the treacherous Magius into the tomb of emperors and sacrificed himself to save Shurima. save Shurima? Had anything that they did that day saved Shurima? Azir had died, murdered by his boyhood friend, and the city was destroyed as unchecked magic of the broken ascension ritual buried it beneath the desert sands. He relived the moment he sealed the doors of the tomb behind Renekton and Xerath every day, knowing there had been no other choice but burdened by the crushing guilt of nothingness. Now Xerath and Renekton were free. Azir had somehow conquered death and become one of the Ascended, and by his will was Shurima reborn. The ancient city had risen from the desert specular and cast off the weary dust of its millennial slumber. But if the tales coming out of the desert were true, the Renekton Nasus had known and loved was gone. He was now little more than a maddened killer that slaughtered without mercy in the name of vengeance. "And I put you there," said Nasus. He reached the summit, and tried to set aside the thoughts of what his brother had become, a monster that roared the name of Nasus over the burning sands of the desert, a monster that he would eventually have to face. Chapter 6. Nasus reached the top of the temple structure, the strips of votive paper fluttering from his arms and belt. He planted the heft of his axe on the rough stone and took a moment to survey his surroundings. Sun reflected from the sun disk in splintered angles, the finish of the metal rough and unpolished. The braided robes were painfully obvious up close, and the crudity of what Valkyria's people had built was all too apparent. The roof was bare of ornamentation, with no great dies carved on the celestial vault of the cardinal winds, no etching of the heroes who had ascended upon its sacred face. 10 warriors in dusty cloaks and overlapping strips of blonde armor stood between Nasus and the Hierophant. The priest was a tall, slender man in a long robe of iridescent feathers, with wide wing-like sleeves and a cowl that represented an ebon beak. The face beneath the cowl was a patrician, stern and unforgiving, just like Azir. "Are you Nasus?" said the Hierophant. The man's voice was deep and imposing, almost regal, but Nasus heard his fear. It was one thing to claim to be the descendant of a god, and quite another to meet one. "That you have to ask tells me that I have been away too long. Yes, I am Nasus, but more importantly, who are you?" The Hierophant stood taller, puffing out his chest like a preening bird in mating season. "I am Azir Telamu, scion of the Hawk Emperor, first voice of Valkyria, the Illuminated One, who walks in the light of the Keeper of the Sacred Fire, bringer of the dawn, and—" "Scion of the Hawk Emperor," interrupted Nasus. "You claim lineage to Emperor Azir?" "I do not claim it. It is who I am," snapped the Hierophant, a measure of confidence returning. "Now tell me what you want." Nasus nodded and spun his axe, holding it in his bare hands, horizontal to the ground. "Your blood," said Nasus. Chapter 7. He slammed the butt of his long-hefted axe against the stonework. A cloud of sand lifted off of the roof, and it hung, shimmering in veils, spinning like in a slow circle around the Hierophant and his warriors. "What are you doing?" demanded the priest. "I told you, I need to see your blood." In a blink of an eye, the circling sand became a roaring hurricane. The warriors raised their arms up to shield their faces from the whipping sandstorm, and the Hierophant bent double, blinded and choking on the wind-blown dust. The sandstorm howled with all the fury of the desert winds, and could strip a flock of Excazul to the bones in minutes. Armor was no protection, the sand penetrating every nook and cranny to reach the skin below it and score it raw. The sun disk swung back and forth in the winds that Nasus had conjured, its supporting ropes pulling taut and the iron rings fitted into the stonework. Nasus let the fury of the sands fill him, his limbs surging with power and his body swelling as the desert's wrath manifested within his dark flesh. His form loomed and grew, towering a monstrous like the first ascended were said to be. He attacked without warning, bludgeoning his way through the guards, smashing them aside with the heft of his axe or the flat of his blade. He had no wish to kill these men, they were sons of Shurima after all, but they were in his way. He stepped over their writhing, groaning bodies towards the Hierophant. The man lay curled in a ball, his bloodied hand held up to protect his face. Nasus reached down and lifted him by the scruff of his neck as easily as a hound might carry a pup. The Hierophant's feet dangled a yard off the ground as Nasus held him to his face. The Hierophant's skin was red raw where the sand had scored him. Tears of blood ran down his cheeks. Nasus moved closer to the sun disk. It wasn't the real thing. It wasn't even gold, but it reflected the light of the sun, and that would have to be enough. You say you are in the line of Azir, he said. Now we will see if that is true. He pressed the Hierophant's face against the sun disk, and the man screamed as the scoring metal burned his exposed skin. Nasus dropped the whimpering man and stared at the hissing blood running down the disk in red rivulets. The blood was already drying to a brown crust, and the scent of it filled his nostrils. Your blood is not that of the ascended bloodline, he said sadly. You are not who I seek. He narrowed his eyes and saw the radiant blue glow reflected off the surface of the disk from something in the far distance. He turned and looked to the horizon. A cloud gathered there, dust kicked up by the feet of marching men. Nasus saw the glitter of sunlight on the spear tips and the armor through the dust. He heard the beating of war drums and the skirl of battle horns. Lumbering beasts emerged from the dust clouds, braying warlike creatures yoked with knotted ropes and directed by groups of men armed with barbed goads. Protected by the calcified skin plates and armed with curling horn tusks, the beasts were living, battering rams easily capable of smashing down Valkyria's already ruined walls. Behind the war beasts, the host of tribal war bands advanced on the city beneath a wide variety of carved totems. 500 warriors at least, light skirmishers, whooping horse archers, and fighting men bearing scale shields and heavy axes. Nasus felt the touch of a dominating will upon them, knowing that many of these tribes would normally tear each other's throats out on sight. Nasus felt the presence of an ancient magic, and the taste of metal flooded his jaws. Every sense heightened. He heard the babble of hundreds of violent voices from below. He saw every imperfection in the bronze disk, and felt every grain of sand beneath his splay-clawed feet. A sharp smell of blood, only recently staunched, stung his nostrils. It carried the faint trace of elder days and the distant echoes of an age lost forever. It called to him from somewhere east of the city, at its very edge where the ruins merged with the hills. The bearer of this awakening magic floated above the host, a being of crackling energy and dark power bound by a chain of cold metal and shards of an ancient sarcophagus, a traitor to Shurima and the architect of an ancient empire's doom. Zira, Nast said. Chapter 8. A ruined house on the eastern edge of Valkyria was crumbling, without much a roof, ankle deep in sand, but it had 4 walls and an overhanging of trees that offered shade during the hottest part of the day. Talia's pack was propped up in the corner, ready to go as it always had. Skins of water and goat's milk hung from its side, and enough dried meat to last a couple of weeks had been packed alongside clothes and pounces of rocks and pebbles gathered over the Valorian. Talia knelt beside the injured woman laying in the shade and lifted the bandages from her side. She winced at the sight of crusted blood around the stitches she'd used to seal the wound. It looked like a sword cut, but she wasn't sure. Talia stripped the woman's armor and bathed her the best she could. Apart from the near mortal wound in her side, the woman's body was a map of pale scar tissue, all earned in a life of battle, and all but one to the fore. Whoever this woman was, only one of her enemies had not met her face to face. Talia replaced the bandage of her patient, and her patient grunted in pain, her sleeping body trying to heal after the great weaver alone knew how much she suffered out in the desert. "You're a fighter," Talia said. "I can tell that about you. So fight for your life." Talia had no idea if the woman heard what she said, but maybe her words could help the woman's spirit find its way back to her body. In any case, it felt good to talk to someone, even if they didn't answer back. Unless she counted fevering mutterings about emperors and being dead. Since leaving Yasuo and Ionia, Talia had tried to keep to herself, always on the move and never staying in one place longer than necessary. She'd already stayed in Valkyria longer than she'd planned, but this was supposed to be a quick stop to buy fresh supplies. But she couldn't leave while this woman was still unconscious. The urge to find her family was all but overwhelming, but the Great Weaver taught that anyone was bound together in the warp and weft of life. To leave one thread to fray would in time affect them all, so Talia had stayed to honor her promise to the wounded woman, though every moment not spent trying to reach her family chafed at her soul. Talia brushed dark hair from the woman's fevered brow and studied her face, trying to imagine how she had come to be wounded and half buried in a sand dune on the edges of the Sai. She was pretty, but she had a hard edge to her not even unconsciousness could entirely soften. Her skin had a tanned, sun-weathered texture of a native-born Shuriman, and when her eyes would occasionally flutter open, Talia saw that they were a piercing blue. She let out a sigh and said, "Well, I don't think there's a lot that I can do until you wake up." Talia heard a thudding boom coming from the west. She moved to the window as she heard the unmistakable sound of rocks grinding on rocks. At first she thought it was an earthquake, but this was more like an avalanche. She had seen a fair few of them in her time. Given what she'd seen of the buildings of Valkyria, it wouldn't surprise her if it was the sound of one of them falling down. She hoped no one was hurt. "What's going on? Where am I?" Talia turned at the sound of the woman's voice. She was sitting up, looking around her and reaching for something. "You're in Valkyria," said Talia. "I found you outside, bleeding and half-dead." "Where's my blade?" demanded the woman. Talia pointed to the wall behind her, where the woman's strange weapon was wrapped in its boiled leather sling was hidden under a woven blanket of interleaved bird motifs. "Over there," said Talia. "Its blades are very sharp, and I didn't want it anywhere I might trip over it and slice my foot." "Who are you?" said the woman, her tone laden with suspicion. "I am Talia." "Do I know you? Does your tribe want me dead?" Talia frowned. "I don't think so. We're herders, weavers and travelers. We don't really want anyone dead." "You're one of the few who don't," said the woman. She exhaled slowly, and Talia could only imagine how badly her side must hurt. She sat up and grimaced as her stitches pulled taut. "Why would anyone want you dead?" asked Talia. "Because I've killed a lot of people," replied Severe, struggling to sit up. Sometimes because I was paid to, sometimes because they were in my way, but these days it's usually because they get very angry when I tell them I'm not going back. Back where? Talia, the woman turned her piercing blue eyes on Talia, and she saw a deep well of pain and turmoil within. The city, she said, the one that rose from the sands. So it's true? Asked Talia. Ancient Shurima was really reborn? You've seen it? With my very own eyes, said the woman. There are a lot of people going there now. I saw tribes of the east and south mostly, but others will come soon enough. People are going there? More every day. So why don't you want to go back? You're tiring me out with all these questions. Talia shrugged. Asking questions is the first step on a journey to understanding. The woman smiled and nodded. Good point, but be careful who you ask. Some people answer questions with a blade. Do you? Sometimes, but since you saved my life, I'll let it go. Then tell me one more thing. What? Your name. Severe, the woman said through her pain. Talia knew the name. There were few Shurimans who did not, and she'd already had a good idea of who this woman was from the style of her cross-bladed weapon. Before she could reply, a new sound overtook the rumble of falling stones. She seldom heard anything like it in her homeland, but she'd heard plenty on the shores of Ionia, and in the warrens of Noxus, and on the icy wastes of the Freljord. Talia eyed her pack, working out how long it would take her to escape. Talia eyed her pack, working out how long it would take her to escape Valkyra. Severe heard the sound too, and swung her legs out as she tried to stand. The effort was almost too much for her, and she grunted. Sweat beaded on her brow with effort. You are in no state to go anywhere, said Talia. Can you hear that? Said Severe. Of course, said Talia. It sounds like people screaming. Severe nodded. That's exactly what it is. Chapter 9. Fire was raining from the sky. Comets of blue flame leapt from Azir's outstretched arms, arcing like boulders from a war machine. The first fell to the earth in the market, exploding like a falling star. Searing fire detonated on the impact. Burning bodies were hurled into the air like blackened kindling. Fiery winds carried Zira's spiteful laughter, the ageless insanity that reveled in the pain of others. How could I not see the evil in him before? Nessus heard screams rising from the city, and all his earlier anger at these people vanished like a morning mist over an oasis. The city walls were smashed aside by the pain-maddening war beast that reared and stamped with the ground-shaking force. Lightly armored warriors streamed into the city over rubble. They howled in a dozen different war cries, eager to begin the slaughter. Nessus spun his axe and descended the temple steps, taking them four at a time until he was back on the ground. Hundreds of people streamed into the main plaza from the western edges of the city, fear pumping in their veins. Bloodthirsty yells at the clash of weapons followed them. Panicked citizens sought refuge in the buildings around the edges of the plaza, bolting doors and shuttering windows in hope that it would keep them safe. Nessus had walked the bloody streets of enough captured cities to know how brutal warriors could be after such battles. Zirath could see every man, every woman in Valkyria put to the sword. More fireballs slammed down like thunderbolts, and the air filled with the screams and smell of burnt flesh. Stones split and tumbled in cascades of molten rock from the impacts of the magical assault. The market was burning, and the pillars of black smoke smudged the sky. Nessus pushed through the terrified crowds, moving steadily eastward, following the spoor of potent blood he now smelt. The Hierophant had been a fraud, his blood weak and diluted after thousands of years. But the one he now sensed, they were strong. He could hear the thunder of the heart beating within the mortal beast. This person came from a line of emperors and warrior queens, men and women of towering ambition and strength. It was the blood of a hero. Men shouted his name, begging for help. He ignored them, knowing that he served a higher calling. The sun had wrought him anew to serve Shurima beyond death, to fight for its people and to defend them against their enemies. He served that purpose now, but leaving the inhabitants of Valkyria to their own doom, twisted a familiar barb of guilt in his soul. How many more will you leave to die? He pushed the thought aside, leaving the path through the broken streets piled high with drifting sand. Most of the buildings here had been claimed by the desert, but a little more than broken foundations and sheared stumps of square-cut columns. Desert scavengers fled the sight of him as he drew closer to the thudding heartbeat. The city began to thin out, its ruins ever more buried in the encroaching sand. Eventually he came to a crumbling structure that might have once served as a bathhouse, the walls thicker and stronger than those around it. He ducked as he entered, smelling the sweat and blood of two souls within. One young, and one with a soul so old it was like coming to face with a friend who walked beneath the same sun as he. A young girl emerged from the doorway, clad in a free-flowing coat from a land across the eastern ocean. The same girl he'd spoken to in the sock. He felt fear in her, but also her determination as her hands, moving and curving, looping patterns as though to weave some naturalistic magic. The ground trembled, and the stones danced at her feet and threw off their coating of sand. Behind her, Nasa saw a woman struggling to stand, using the peeling walls for support. Her tunic was soaked in red, a grievous wound, but not yet a mortal one. "I am Nasus, curator of the sands," he said, but from the look in her eyes she already knew who he was. Her mouth fell open in astonishment, but she did not move. "Stand aside, girl," he said. "No, I won't let you hurt her. I made a promise." Nasus swung his axe, slinging it across his back as he took a step forward. The girl backed into the ruin, the ground rippling in radiating patterns at her feet. Rock lifted from the ground as flakes of plaster peeled from the walls. Cracks split the stonework, racing upwards to what remained of the roof. The last time he had faced someone with similar abilities, he had been immortal, and it almost killed him. The injured woman stared at the girl in shock. Clearly, she was entirely arrogant of her companion's abilities. "You have the power to break the rock of Shurima," said Nasus. She cocked an eyebrow. "Yes, so you better back off before I break you." Nasus grinned at her bravado. "You possess a hero's heart, girl, but you are not the one I seek. Your magic is strong, so if I were you, I would leave the city before Zirath rips it from you." Her skin paled. "I'm not going anywhere. I promised I'd protect Severe, and the Great Weaver hates broken promises. If you are her protector, then no, I am not here to hurt her." "So what do you want?" "I'm here to save her." The bandaged woman limped to stand at the young girl's side. Though she was in obvious pain, Nasus was impressed at her resolve, but then he should expect no less from someone whose blood flowed directly from the ancient Shuriman. "Who is this Zirath?" she asked. "A dark magus who already knows too much of your existence." The woman nodded and turned to Talia, placing a calloused hand on the young girl's shoulder. "I owe you my life, but I won't be in anyone's debt," she said. "So consider your promise fulfilled. I can take it from here." The relief on the girl's face was plain, but she still hesitated. "I appreciate that, but you can barely walk," said Talia. Let me help you out of the city." Deal, said Severe gratefully. Before turning back to Nessus, she swung her hand around to reveal the glittering cross-shaped blade of gold with an emerald gemstone in its center. She held it at the ready, a weapon no ordinary mortal could wield with such ease. I've had enough of people saving me lately, she said. They always want something in return, so tell me, big man, what do you really want? To keep you alive, said Nessus. I can do that without your help. That wound in your side tells me otherwise. You are this? Said Severe before he could finish. Just a disagreement with some fools who couldn't take no for an answer. Trust me, I've had worse and walked away. I don't need protecting. Fate seems to be looking out for me these days, no matter what I do. Nessus shook his head. How little mortals understood of destiny. The future is not set in stone, he said. It is a branching river whose course can change at any moment. Even those whose fate is written in the stars can find the water of their lives run to barren ground if they are not careful. He gestured at Severe's weapon and said, Do you know to whom that blade once belonged? Does it matter? Asked Severe. It's mine now. It is the Cheliker, the blade that was once borne by Setaka, the former warrior queen of the the ascended host. Even enough of us remain for that name to mean something. I was honored to fight at Setka's side for 3 centuries. Her deeds were legendary, but I see you do not know her name. The fallen are forgotten, said Severe with a shrug. Nessus ignored Severe's cold dismissal of her quintet's war sister and said, The desert starlight once told her she would see the sun rise on the day a Shurima emperor ruled the entire world. It made her think she was invincible, for we were yet to conquer the world. But she was brought down by monsters on the eve of Ithaca's doom. I held her as the light dimmed from her, and I set her to her slumber far below the sands, with her weapon upon her breast. If you are here to take it, then you and I might have a problem. Nessus dropped to one knee and crossed his hands over his chest. You are of the ascended bloodline. The weapon is yours to bear, for the blood of the Emperor runs in your veins. It resurrected Azir and Shurima, so that must mean something. No, it doesn't, snapped Severe. I never asked Azir to bring me back. I don't owe him anything, and I don't want anything to do with you or this Zirath. Your wants are irrelevant, said Nessus. Zirath will kill you whether you embrace your destiny or not. He has come to end the bloodline of Azir once and for all. What does Azir want with her? Asked Talia. And what is he going to do with her now that he's back? Does he want to make us slaves? She asks a lot of questions, said Severe. Nessus hesitated before answering. In truth, I do not know what Azir plans. That he will stand against Zirath is enough for me, and now you can both meekly bare your necks, or you can live to fight another day. Severe lifted her tunic to show her blood-wetted bandage and gave a wry grin. I've never done anything meekly in my days, but I don't plan to be fighting anything more threatening than sleep for a while. You must live, said Nessus, rising to his full height, and you need to be ready. Ready for what? Asked Severe, as she and Talia began gathering up their few possessions. The battle for Shurima, said Nessus. So for now we must run. Zirath's warriors are killing everyone in Valkyria. What's so special about this place? Asked Talia, shrugging on her pack. They are looking for her, said Nessus. Severe's face hardened as she let out a long breath before saying, Nessus, eh? I've heard stories about you since I was a child, stories of war and heroic battles. All legends say that you and your brother were Shurima's protectors, yes? That is true, said Nessus. Renekton and I fought for Shurima over many centuries. Severe took a halting step towards him, her face set with the imperious determination as Azir had been on the day that He ordered the priesthood to prepare the sun disk for his ascension, in defiance of centuries of tradition. "Then fight for Shurima now," said Severe, with as impervious as any emperor. "Sons and daughters of the desert are dying out there as we speak. If you are a hero I've heard of all my life, then it is your duty to get out there and save as many people as possible." This was not how Nasus had imagined this meeting to go, but Severe's talk of duty fanned an ember that had slumbered too long within his breast. He felt its flame spread through him, and only now understanding how truly lost he had been all along, lonely years since Shurima's fall and subsequent rebirth. "You have an oath, and it will be so. You have my oath, and it will be so," said Nasus, reaching up to unhook a pendant hung on a leather thong around his neck. "If you both go now, I shall do all I can to protect Valkyria's people." The stone of his pendant was jade, ocean green, with with veins of pale gold threading on its surface. A faint light emanated from within, pulsing like a slowing heartbeat. He offered it to Severe and said, "Wear this, and it will keep you from Xerath's sight. It will not last forever, but maybe long enough." "Long enough for what?" asked Severe. "For me to find you again," said Nasus, turning away. Chapter 10. He left Severe and Talia before she could change his mind, knowing their best chance of survival was to draw Xerath's warriors to him. They watched him go, and he did not turn back. Flames burned at the center of the city, and Nasus followed the screams of the Valkyrian inhabitants. His anger built as he passed the bodies of men and women cut down by rampaging warriors. More deaths to add to the tally still to be settled between him and Xerath. Nasus rolled his shoulders to loosen his muscles, and the last time he had faced the Magius his brother had been beside him, and a tremor of fear touched him. "We could not defeat him together. How can I defeat him alone?" Nasus saw a group of 5 warriors blocking the exit from the plaza. They had their backs to him, but turned at the sound of him unsheathing his axe. He should have felt their terror and the prospect of fighting an ascended warrior, but the blue fire of Xerath's will burned in their eyes, and they feared nothing. They rushed at him with bloodied swords and spears. Nasus met their charge head on, swinging low and splitting 3 of them in half with a single sweep of his blade. He put his fist through the chest of another and fastened his jaws on the bare head of the last man. Nasus bit down, and the warrior's skull burst open. He entered the plaza, seeing what remained of the city's inhabitants kneeling at sword point before the Sun Temple, heads bowed like cowed worshippers. The groups of bloodied warriors thrust their spears aloft towards the bright and terrible god burning at the summit. The burning body of the traitorous Magius hung suspended in the air, the edges of the sun disk molten beneath the furnace heat of his ascended body. The screaming figure of the Hierophant writhed in the air before him. "You mortals are fools," said Xerath as he unraveled flesh from the bones of the Hierophant's body. "Why do you claim lineage to an emperor as worthless as Azir?" "Xerath!" shouted Nasus, his voice echoing around the plaza. The mortal warriors turned, but made no move to attack. Silence fell, and Nasus felt hatred radiating from Xerath and wash over him like a surging tide. What was left of the Hierophant's body burned to cinders in a heartbeat, drifting away in the hot wind swirling around the Magius. Nasus marched to the plaza with his axe held tight to his side as every pair of eyes turned his way. "Of course it would be you," said Xerath, his voice as honeyed as it had been when he walked as a mortal. "Who else but the coward who sealed me beneath the world for a millennia?" "I will put you back there," promised Nasus. Xerath's form burned brighter. "You had your beloved brother to help you then. Tell me, have you seen Renekton since our shared prison was broken open?" "Do not speak his name," snarled Nasus. "Have you seen what he's become?" Nasus said nothing, and Zirath laughed, the sound like warring fire spirits. Of course you haven't, continued Zirath, the trapped flame of his being pulsing with dark amusement. He would have killed you on sight. Zirath drifted down the crumbling walls of the temple, flames licking along his limbs and drifting away like fireflies. The dominated soldier stood still as statue. This confrontation was not for mortals. The power within you was meant for Azir, said Nasus, taking slow steps towards Zirath. You were not chosen by the sun, and neither was Renekton, but he was raised up. Do not say his name, Nasus said through gritted fangs. Your brother was weak, but you knew that already, didn't you? Said Zirath, drifting closer. He broke more easily than I could have imagined. All it took was telling him how you had abandoned him in the darkness, and how you had trapped him with his enemy and left him to die. Nasus knew the Magius was goading him, but hate blinded him to all else but the sundering chains that had kept the unimaginable power of Zirath's body contained. They faced each other in the center of the city, two ascended beings out of time, a warrior king and a Magius of living magic. Chapter 11. Nasus attacked first, his body going from motionless to blinding speed in the space between heartbeats. His leg pistoned him into the air, his axe swinging overhead in a downward arc. The blade smashed into Zirath's chest, the chain links exploded from the impact. Zirath was hurled back into the walls of the temple, the stonework split apart, and dust from the tomb far below billowed from the zigzagging cracks. Vast panels of stone fell from the building, and the Magius hurled himself forward, searing beams of energy blazing from his crackling limbs. Nasus howled as Zirath's fire burned him, and they slammed together with ferocious power. A shockwave of magical energy exploded outward, spinning people away like leaves in a hurricane. The nearest buildings collapsed, and a seismic force shattered their walls. The curious people fled, trying to find safety in the midst of these brawling gods of ancient days. His hold on them broken, Zirath's warriors scattered and ran for the edges of the city. Flames erupted as Zirath called the arcane fire from the heart of his being and unleashed it indiscriminately. Nasus rolled aside as a series of glittering comets slammed down. Their fire was cold, but it burnt just the same. He rose to his feet in time to use the spinning axe to deflect a series of screeching orbs of white light. Nasus floated in the air above them, laughing as forked lightning blazed around him. Nasus thrust his blade at the Magius to unleash a burst of withering power. Nasus roared in pain and anger, the fire of his heart flickering, but undimmed. Nasus leapt towards Zirath. They grappled in midair and to smash into the Sun Temple once again. Their impact shattered the outer wall, and huge blocks of stone toppled from the summit. They slammed down like the fists of ancient tomb guardians, cracking the earth and exposing the temple's shadowed crypts. The remains of the sun disk fell from the roof, tumbling downwards like a flipped coin of a giant. It shattered as it hit the ground, sending gleaming metal diving in all directions. A shard buried itself in the meat of Nasus' thigh. He wrenched it clear, and shimmering blood ran down his leg. Zirath rose from the wreckage of the shattered stone, and a searing bolt of pale fire struck Nasus in the chest. He grunted and staggered backwards. Zirath unleashed another torrent of glittering magical energy, and it was this time it hammered Nasus' heart. The pain was all-consuming, and he fell to his knees, his skin scorched raw. Nasus could fight a mortal army single-handedly, but Zirath was no ordinary foe. He was an ascended being who wielded the stolen strength of the sun and the power of dark magic. He lifted his head as the city burned around him. The one you seek is not here, and now hidden beyond your sight. The last of Azir's brood cannot hide from me forever, said Zirath. I will find them and end that worthless bloodline. Nasus held out his axe, the gemstone upon his blade throwing off crackling lines of force. I will die before I allow that to happen. As you wish, said Zirath, his arms pulling back again and again to hurl arcing trajectories of light. Nasus did what he could, but could not stop them all. Zirath drifted towards him and said, I told your brother over and over again of your betrayal and the jealousy that you kept hidden from him. He cursed your name and wept as he told me how he would rend you limb from limb. Nasus roared and surged to his feet. A volcanic pillar of fire erupted beneath Zirath. The Magius bellowed as the shimmering fire of many suns engulfed him. But it was not enough. It could never be enough, and the last time they fought, Nasus and Renekton had been at the height of their powers. Now, Nasus was only a shadow of his former glory, and Zirath's power had been growing for centuries. The Magius shrugged off his last desperate attack, and Nasus had nothing left to give. Zirath's magic lifted him and swung him around, hurling him into the crumbling ruins of the temple. Stonework shattered around him as he felt his sun-infused bones snap like tinder wood. Nasus came to a halt amidst the rubble, his legs broken and twisted beneath him. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, shattered from shoulder to wrist. He tried to push himself upright with his good arm, but white-hot pain surged up his spine where his back had broken. His body could heal these wounds in time, but he had no time left. How far you have fallen, Nasus, said Zirath, drifting towards him, with goblets of liquid fire dripping from his fingertips like cinders. I would pity you if I didn't hate you for what you did to me. Your spirit has broken in the long years you wandered alone and burdened. Better to be broken and burdened than an oath-breaker, coughed Nasus through a mouthful of blood. Even with all your newfound power, you are still a betrayer and a slave. He felt Zirath's fury and reveled in it. This was all he had left. I am no slave, said Zirath. Azir's last act was to free me. Nasus was stunned. Zirath, a free man? But it made no sense. Then why all this? Why betray Azir? Azir was a fool, and his gift was offered too late, said Zirath. Nasus grunted in pain. The splintered bones in his shoulders ground together as they began reknitting. He felt strength returning to his arm, but kept it limp and useless looking. What will you do when I am dead? Said Nasus, remembering how much Azir had loved the sound of his own voice, and what will become of Shurima if you are its emperor? He tried to keep his pain hidden as his transformed flesh worked wonders within his body to undo the damage Zirath had done. The Magius shook his head and lifted out of reach. Do you think I cannot see your body renewing itself? He said. Then come down here and fight me, cried Nasus. I have pictured your death 1,000 times, said Zirath, rising beyond the hollowed temple, but never by my hand. He watched the Magius rise as the unsupported walls of the temple groaned and cracked, leaning in, ready to fall. The Butcher of the Sands will have his due, said Zirath, his form blazing brighter than the sun disk ever had. Rocks and dust trembled from above, and I will be there to watch him claw the meat from your bones. The Magius hurled chains of white fire into the crumbling walls and said, But until then, I entomb you beneath the sands, as you once trapped me. Zirath blazed like a newborn star and dragged his fiery chains inward. The thunderous rain of broken stones fell in an avalanche as murderous fire poured from the sky to fill Valkyria. The ground felt like it was breaking apart, the rock beneath Nasus spinning and rising up to meet the cascade in a deafening tsunami of fluid stone. The walls of the temple crashed down, burying Nasus beneath hundreds of tons of debris. Chapter 12. After the darkness, light. A sliver of hot brightness. Sunlight? At first he wasn't sure if it was real or some trick devised by his mind to ease a body into death. Was this how an ascended being died? No, this was not death. The sunlight moved across his field of vision, and he felt it warm his skin. He shifted his weight, extending his legs and rotating his shoulders. His limbs were renewed, which meant that he had spent a considerable amount of time in the darkness. His body healed fast, but he had no idea how long he had spent unconscious. However long it was too long. Zeroth was free and stronger than ever. Nessus reached up, seeing the rock above him formed into a perfect dome, its rippling underside glass smooth and warm to the touch. Even in the half-light he could make out its patterned surface, swirling like paint mixed on an artist's palette. He slammed his fist against the slivers of light again and again, until the rock finally split apart in chunks of stone, vitrified by intense heat. Light flooded in, and he saw the entire temple was now little more than a jumbled heap of smashed blocks. Nessus bent to lift a shard of the broken dome that had protected him. He turned it over in his hand, seeing that blended material had no business being in one piece of rock. He slipped the dagger-like shard into his tunic and walked from the smashed sun temple. He surveyed the ruins as a mournful wind sighed, its breath freighted with mutterings of the dead. The city was gone, or at least what its inhabitants had built upon its ruins. Nessus saw that much of the bedrock had buckled upward and had the same rippling texture of the dome that had saved his life. The leading edge of every surface undulated with glazed tidal wave frozen in mid-surge. From beneath that wave, sheltered from Zeroth's killing fire, came handfuls of Valkyria's inhabitants. They had come once in twos and first, then in small groups, blinking in the sunlight, amazed at their miraculous survival. Nessus gave a small nod and said, "Shurima thanks you, Talia," as he turned and made his way from the city. The rest of Valkyria had returned to its desolate shell that had been the last time Nessus had ventured this way. Broken walls, shattered foundations of stumps and columns that stood like dead trees in the petrified forest. He had seen ruins like this before, in the wake of his first battle with Zeroth, when Shurima fell. Guilt had caused him to turn his face from the world then, but he did not do so now. Zeroth had spoken of Renekton as a blood-maddened beast, but Nessus knew his brother better than the Magius ever had. Zeroth now saw only the beast Renekton had become, forgetting the noble warrior that lay beneath, the man who had selflessly offered his own life for his brother, the warrior who had willingly sacrificed everything to save his homeland from a betrayer. Zeroth had forgotten all of that, but Nessus never would. If Renekton lived, then part of him must remember the hero he once was. If Nessus could reach that part of his brother, then he might lift him from the pit of madness. Nessus had long believed that he would one day face Renekton, but it wasn't until now that he had imagined that encounter would end with one of them dead. Now he knew differently. Now he had a purpose. Now the bloodline of Azir endured, and there was yet hope. "I need you, Renekton," he said. "I cannot kill Zeroth without you." Before him the desert called his name. Behind him the sand reclaimed Valkyria. So that is the end of the story that they put out. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty interesting that they had almost everyone besides like a Mumu and Rammus in the story, and they kind of, well, and Renekton, he was mentioned though in the story. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. If you liked it, you can leave a like and a subscribe. Feel free to comment into things that I can do differently, or things you want to see, or just to talk if you want. I mean, that's fine too. So I hope everybody has a nice day, and I will talk to you guys later.